If this has you curious about the ending, don't wait any longer. Subscribe to our channel right now and leave a like to support more chilling content.
It was 11 p.m., and I was driving home after an exhausting extended shift. The drizzle outside fell relentlessly, making the windshield wipers move in a monotonous, almost hypnotic rhythm. The road was eerily empty, and the flickering streetlights swayed in the fierce wind. As I drove slowly through the narrow streets, I found myself fighting off both fatigue and an inexplicable sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air. Out of nowhere, a bolt of lightning struck a power pole directly in front of me. The blinding flash turned the world into a stark contrast of light and shadow, and the deafening sound made the floor of my car vibrate. Sparks rained down like a disturbing, chaotic firework display. For a brief moment, the sparks illuminated something unusual on the side of the road, just beyond the wreckage of the transformer. Startled, I slammed on the brakes, causing the car to slide across the wet road until it came to a halt. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to regain control of my breath, the sound of my pulse louder than the rain hammering on the roof. His hat projected a shadow that hid almost his, but I could see something shining under the flap. Eyes? No. They were small reflections, like those of something metallic. He raised a hand and pointed it directly at the medallion, as if he demanded that I give it to him before I could react. The sheet of paper on the table moved as if it were blown by an inexistent wind. The symbols on it began to change in front of my eyes, reorganizing into something that looked like a map. I held it with shaky hands, feeling an inexplicable urge to decipher it. But before I could examine it more closely, I heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. I ran to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked through the magic eye, but there was no one. Only the sound of footsteps continued. It was as if something was moving in circles around the house, faster and faster, higher and higher. Suddenly, the sound stopped. My breathing was heavy, and each muscle of my body screamed for me to run. But where to? It was then that something broke the silence, a serious sound, like that of metal scraping against metal. It came from the back door. I held the medallion with more strength and advanced slowly there, with the paper still in the other hand. "Who's there?" I shouted again, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. There was no answer. But the paper began to spin. I took a step back, and the medallion shone with an unexpected intensity, illuminating the room with a golden and warm light. It was at that moment that I heard something that made my blood freeze. A soft knock on the window glass next to me. I looked, and there was the man in the coat, closer than ever. Another thunder rumbled, and all the lights in the house went out. I was in total darkness for a moment that felt like an eternity. The sound of the rain was muffled now, as if the world itself had stopped. I turned on my phone's flashlight. But when I did, I realized I was no longer alone in the room. There were shadows inside with me. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and the medallion began to pulse, emitting a faint but rhythmic light like a beating heart. Suddenly, one of the shadows stood out from the others. It was taller, more defined. I knew I was no longer dealing with something human. A low, guttural voice echoed in the room. "You shouldn't have touched it." But before I could react, something invaded my mind. It wasn't physical pain, but an avalanche of images that seemed to be forced into my head. I saw places I'd never been to, people I'd never met, and symbols like those on the medallion engraved in caves, walls, and even bodies. When I came to, I was on the floor. The room was empty, but the paper with the map was now different. The drawing was clearer, showing a specific location, a clearing in the forest that began behind my neighborhood. I knew it wasn't a coincidence, but how could I leave? The man, or whatever he was still out there. And for the first time, a certainty hit me, like a punch. The medallion wasn't something I had just found. It wanted to be found, but why? And why me? I grabbed the map and tucked the medallion away, determined to figure out what it all meant, even if it was the last thing I did. I climbed the stairs to my room, trying to come up with a plan. That's when I realized I was no longer alone. In the hallway mirror, there was something written, drawn in the same handwriting as the Symbols, time is running out. I had no idea what I was about to face, but I knew this was just the beginning. I reached the point where the map indicated the start of the path, the entrance to the forest behind the neighborhood. I had walked there before, but that night it felt different. The trees, which were once familiar, now seemed taller, darker, as if they were watching me. I swallowed hard and moved forward, the map faintly glowing as I approached the marked spot. In the middle of the trail, I heard something. It wasn't the sound of rain nor the wind between the trees. It was a rhythmic rustling, as if something was following me, keeping its distance. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I turned it back, illuminating the twisted branches. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. I kept walking, the hum of the medallion growing louder, almost as if it were communicating with something ahead. That's when I saw it, in the clearing. There was an ancient structure, partially covered by vegetation. It looked like some kind of altar, symbols similar to those on the medallion carved into its stones. As I got closer, I saw a circular slot at the altar's center, exactly the size of the medallion. I hesitated. Every fiber of my being screamed not to place the object there, but at the same time, something inside me knew it was what I had to do. As I bent down to fit the medallion, the forest seemed to come alive. The wind picked up, howling through the trees as if carrying voices. Indistinct whispers filled the air, and the shadows around me began to move. The medallion fit perfectly into the altar. The moment I did, an intense light burst from the ground, blinding me. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I realized I was no longer in the forest. The altar was now in ruins, shrouded in mist. Around me were hooded figures, as still as statues. They formed a circle. At the center, where the medallion had been, was a glowing portal, pulsing with golden and blue light. One of the figures moved. Its hood fell, revealing a face that seemed human, but at the same time, it wasn't. Its eyes were empty, as if they absorbed all the light around. "You have opened the path," said the figure, its voice reverberating like an endless echo. "What path?" I asked, stepping back. "What do you want from me?" "It's not about what we want from you," it replied, tilting its head slightly. "It's about what you have already given." Before I could respond, another figure stepped forward, handing me something. It was a key, but not an ordinary key. It was intricately carved with the same symbols as the medallion. The figure pointed to the portal. "Time is running out. The choice is yours. Enter or turn back." My mind was in chaos. Enter that portal? Where would it take me? And if I didn't enter, what would happen? Before I could decide, the medallion began to glow again, but this time the light was coming from inside the portal. It was as if something within it was calling to me. Finally, with my heart in my throat, I took a step forward. The portal shone intensely, engulfing me completely. Crossing the portal felt like diving into an ocean of light. My vision was swallowed by colors I couldn't name, while a deep and distant sound vibrated in my ears. I felt as if I were being pulled in every direction at once, until suddenly everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was no longer in the forest. The ground beneath my feet was polished stone, and the sky above me was a veil of stars. The stars pulsed slowly as if they were breathing. The air was warm but charged with an energy that made every hair on my body stand on end. Around me were the ruins of an ancient temple, covered with symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. On one of the walls, I recognized the same patterns that were on the medallion and the map. However, what caught my attention was a figure in the distance. It was tall, slender, and its skin seemed to be made of a shimmering, almost metallic material. It wasn't human. "You have finally arrived," the figure said without moving its mouth. The voice seemed to echo inside my head. I wanted to ask where I was, but before I could say anything, she extended her hand. The medallion, which was in my pocket, flew to her as if magnetized. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "This was never yours. It was an invitation," she replied, as the medallion began to spin in her hands, projecting lights and images around us. The images showed a different world. It was Earth, but not as we know. The cities were ruins, covered by vegetation, and the sky was dark, dominated by constant storms. A gigantic silhouette, almost the size of a mountain, moved slowly as if searching for something. I asked, terrified. "What will happen if you fail?" the figure replied. "The portal was opened because the balance was broken. You were chosen to fix it." "Me? Why?" I asked, my voice full of despair. "Because you found it, and now you must decide. We trust you." Before I could ask more questions, the figure disappeared and the ground started to shake. In the center of the temple, a circular door began to open, revealing a staircase descending
There was no
into
other
darkness. With a heavy heart, I began to descend. As I disappeared into the portal, the world I left behind began to feel the effects. The forest around the altar became eerily silent, as if all life had fled. The sky, once filled with storm clouds, was now painted with an orange hue, like a sunset that would never end. In my neighborhood, things also started to change. Neighbors reported feeling a weight in the air, as if something invisible was watching. Some people began to hear whispers at night, while others found strange symbols carved into doors and windows. No one could explain it, but everyone felt something was deeply wrong. My house in particular seemed to be the epicenter of everything. The police, called by neighbors worried about my disappearance, found it empty. But the altar in the backyard was glowing. The officers who tried to enter the site reported an inexplicable sense of dread, and some even fainted. Only one object was found on the altar, the map, now completely burned. Meanwhile, the hooded figures I had encountered began appearing in different parts of the neighborhood. Witnesses described them as living shadows, but every time someone tried to follow them, they disappeared. The community began to panic. Conspiracy theories emerged, talking about ancient cults, rituals, and portals to other worlds. One night, however, something even stranger happened. Neighbors reported seeing bright lights coming from the forest, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the streets. When people went out to investigate, they saw huge footprints, as if something gigantic had passed through. There were no signs of destruction, but everyone knew it was a warning. On the other side of the portal, as I descended the dark stairs of the temple, I began to notice something strange. My body was changing. My hands glowed faintly, as if the energy of the medallion was still in me. That's when I heard a voice. It wasn't the figure who had given me the key, but a child. "You cannot return. They are waiting for you." The voice echoed, and images of my neighborhood began to project on the staircase walls. I could see the neighbors, the hooded figures, and something bigger. A gigantic shadow covering everything. That's when I understood. Whatever I did there would define the fate of my world. I wasn't just trying to survive, I was trying to save everyone.
Second true story. Have you ever heard that inner voice that seems to scream at you not to do something?
Sometimes it comes as a soft whisper, other times as a deafening scream in your mind. Maybe you've already felt that premonition, that inexplicable warning that seems beyond logic. But the real question is, would you have the courage to listen to that voice and trust it? What would you do if your life depended on it? The story I'm about to tell you is about one of those moments, an instant where the line between life and death was drawn by instinct, or perhaps something more. It's a real and unsettling account. That happened to my Aunt Karina when she was just over 20 years old. What started as an ordinary trip turned into a nightmare she would never forget. It all began on a quiet afternoon. Karina had a habit of driving along long, deserted roads, connecting her parents' house to that of her then-boyfriend, my uncle. It was a routine trip, but no less challenging. The roads were isolated with miles of nothing but desert, and a horizon that seemed to stretch forever. It was the kind of place where you could go hours without passing another car, a perfect setting for the unexpected or the sinister. That day, the sun painted the sky with shades of orange and pink as Karina drove. She was alone, but it didn't seem to bother her. The radio played her favorite songs and everything seemed peaceful. Until in the rearview mirror, she noticed something peculiar. A dark car that had seemed distant was now approaching slowly, almost as if it were matching her pace. At first, she didn't pay much attention. It was normal for other cars to occasionally appear on the road, even if rarely. But as time went on, something began to bother her. The car wasn't just approaching. It seemed to be dancing behind her, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. It was as if the driver wanted her to notice their presence. And then the signals came. The headlights began flashing repeatedly. The car made strange movements, as if the driver was trying to communicate with Karina. It was at that moment her heart started to race. Could something be wrong with my car? She thought. Maybe a loose wheel, maybe an engine problem. Logic told her she should stop and check. Karina began to slow down, looking for a place to pull over. But before she could do so, something very strange happened. A clear, almost audible voice echoed in her mind. "Don't stop." At first she ignored it, thinking it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then the voice came back, stronger, more insistent. "Don't stop, Karina. Don't stop now." She froze for a moment, unsure whether to follow the warning or trust logic. And it was in that moment of hesitation that she looked at her rearview mirror again. The dark car was closer than ever. The driver was gesturing insistently with his hand, signaling for her to pull over. Something about him, maybe the faint smile, maybe the fixed stare, sent a chill down her spine. Karina took a deep breath and made her choice. She would trust the voice. She stepped on the accelerator and kept going, even though her heart was racing and her mind was full of questions. In the rearview mirror, she saw the dark car hesitate for a moment but then resume the chase. Now she was sure something was very wrong. Whoever that man was, he didn't have good intentions. The road, once silent and empty, now felt like an arena of impending danger. Karina accelerated, but the pursuer did the same, staying close behind. With every curve, the tension grew. Her mind raced with questions. What does he want? Why is he following me? Can I escape? And then, in the distance, she spotted a possible salvation. Two massive trucks moving down the road ahead. Determined to use them as protection, Karina pressed the accelerator even harder, her heart pounding like never before. She knew that if she could get close to those trucks, she might be safe. But would the pursuer give up so easily? The years went by, and Karina recovered from that night. She moved on with her life, got married to my uncle, and started a family. However, that night never completely left her mind. She rarely spoke about what happened, but she always emphasized the importance of listening to our intuition, especially in dangerous situations. It was only years later that she found the answer she had been searching for. On an ordinary day, while folding clothes in the kitchen, Karina was listening to a TV program. It was an interview with a death row inmate who described, with chilling coldness, how he selected his victims. He spoke about how he would drive along deserted roads, looking for women driving alone. "I'd flash my lights, honk, and signal that there was something wrong with their car," he said, with a disturbing smile on his face. "When they stopped, that's when I'd make my move." Karina froze. Her hands, which had been calmly folding a towel, stopped mid-air. The man continued. "A few escaped, 2 or 3 maybe, but most weren't that lucky." She dropped the towel on the floor and walked into the living room. When she looked at the TV, her heart nearly stopped. The toothless grin, the dark eyes, the face etched in her memory. It was him, the man who had chased her down that deserted road. At that moment, Karina realized just how much that inner voice, or perhaps something divine, had saved her life. If she had stopped that night, she probably wouldn't be here to tell the story. This is the kind of experience that makes us wonder, where do these feelings come from? Are they really just intuitions, or is something greater guiding us in moments of danger? How many times have you ignored a warning from your own instincts? This story is a reminder that often, trusting our intuition can mean the difference between life and death. If you were in Karina's place, would you have listened to that inner voice? After seeing that face on television, Karina was in shock. The memory of that night came rushing back, as though it were happening all over again. Her hands trembled as she tried to make sense of what it meant. The man was imprisoned, convicted of a series of horrific crimes, but what shook her most was the fact that he mentioned that a few women had narrowly escaped. Deep down, she knew she was one of them. Determined to learn more, Karina began researching the case. She discovered that he had operated for years on deserted roads, hunting his victims with terrifying precision. On several occasions, he used exactly the same tactic he had tried on Karina: flashing lights, insistent signals, and an outwardly harmless demeanor to gain his victims' trust. However, his true intentions were dark. One particular detail shook her to the core. The man always carried tools in his car, including ropes and knives. He had a well-defined plan to neutralize any resistance. Learning this made Karina realize just how close she had come to a horrifying fate. If it hadn't been for that voice, that inexplicable intuition, her story would have ended tragically. Karina never saw that man again, but the impact he left on her life was profound. For a long time, she avoided driving alone, especially in deserted areas. Even years later, when she was much older, she would still nervously glance in the rearview mirror while driving, as if fearing that something similar might happen again. This experience was not just a lesson for Karina, but also for everyone around her. Whenever someone shared a story about ignoring a gut feeling or dismissing a sense of warning, Karina would intervene. She would say, "Listen to your intuition, because sometimes it's all we have." What's fascinating about this story is how it reminds us of the fragility of life and how seemingly small decisions can change everything. Karina had 2 choices that night: to trust logic and stop as the pursuer wanted, or to keep going, even without being sure it was the right thing to do. Fortunately, she chose to listen to her intuition, and that choice kept her alive. But this raises an intriguing question. What is this inner voice? Is it an instinctive reaction of our brain to something we subconsciously perceive? Or is it something beyond that? Something spiritual, perhaps? Over the years, Karina came to believe that there was something greater at that moment. She described the feeling as a divine force that spoke to her to protect her. While we can neither prove nor refute this interpretation, what we know for certain is that listening to that warning saved her life. If this story had ended there, it would already be powerful. But its impact goes further. What makes Karina's experience so memorable is that she not only survived but also learned a valuable lesson about the power of instinct and the danger of underestimating it. Even years later, when telling the story, Karina always emphasized, if something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't ignore the signs. She passed this lesson on to her children and friends, ensuring they never forgot the importance of trusting their instincts, especially in situations where danger might not be obvious. And you? Have you ever been in a situation where your instincts tried to warn you about something, and you chose to ignore it? Or perhaps you listened to that inner voice and, by doing so, avoided a danger you couldn't see clearly. Think for a moment about how often we make decisions based on logic, ignoring that unsettling feeling that seems to come out of nowhere. This story is a powerful reminder that our instincts are essential survival tools, often alerting us to things our conscious mind cannot understand. Don't ignore those warnings. They can be the difference between making it home safely and becoming a story in a mystery program. Remember, we don't always need immediate answers or logic to act. Sometimes, listening to that small voice inside us is all we need to save our lives. After that night, Karina's life returned to normal, at least on the surface. She built a family, cared for her children, and seemed happy. But those tense moments on the road never completely left her. On sleepless nights, she would mentally return to that dark car, that unsettling smile, and the feeling of imminent danger. Sometimes she would wake up startled, sweating, with the image of the man chasing her etched in her mind like an emotional scar. One thing she never told most people, not even my uncle, was how obsessed she became with understanding what happened that night. Karina began following true crime cases and survivor accounts. She read articles, watched documentaries, and delved into stories of other women who had faced similar situations. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a search for answers, an attempt to make sense of what had happened. During one of these searches, she came across something that gave her chills. In an online forum discussing unsolved crimes, someone described a case eerily similar to hers. A woman had been pursued on a deserted road by a dark car, with the driver trying to make her stop. The difference? This woman hadn't been as lucky as Karina. Her car was found abandoned on the side of the road with signs of a struggle and bloodstains inside. Her body was never found. Karina felt her heart tighten as she read the account. There was no doubt in her mind. The man who chased her was a predator. He had done it before and likely continued to do so afterward. Knowing this brought a mix of emotions. On the one hand, she felt lucky to have escaped. On the other, she felt an overwhelming guilt for not doing more to report him. She wondered, if I had gone to the police back then, could he have been caught before hurting others? Years later, Karina finally found the courage to share her story in detail with the family. It was during a Christmas gathering when we were talking about scary situations we'd lived through. She told us everything, from the moment she noticed the dark car to the moment she saw the pursuer's face on television. The room fell silent. Each of us was processing the gravity of what she had lived through. My father was the first to speak. He asked why she had never reported the incident to the police. Karina explained that at the time, she thought no one would believe her. After all, she didn't have concrete evidence. She had only managed to escape. Furthermore, the fear of being ridiculed or facing a system that might not take her story seriously paralyzed her. It was a decision she deeply regretted. After that conversation, we decided to investigate together whether the man who appeared on television was indeed the one who chased her that night. We researched his case and found a list of possible victims, all young women traveling alone. Some had disappeared under circumstances similar to what Karina experienced. While we couldn't confirm it 100%, all signs pointed to the fact that Karina had escaped one of the most dangerous predators of that time. Today, Karina believes that what saved her was more than just luck. She calls it divine intervention. But regardless of how you interpret it, the fact remains that listening to her intuition made the difference. She learned that in moments of danger, trusting yourself might be the only survival tool you have. The end. For many, this story is an unsettling reminder. that evil can be closer than we imagine. What makes this experience so powerful is that it's not just a suspense story but also a testament to courage, intuition, and survival. Karina lived to tell her story, and her lesson is clear. When you feel something is wrong, trust that feeling. It might be the only thing standing between you and danger. And you? Have you ever been in a situation where ignoring a gut feeling could have cost you dearly? This story shows us that, in critical moments, trusting our intuition can be the wisest decision of all. On a deserted road late at night, you come across someone hitchhiking. The person seems harmless, maybe even in need. What would you do? Would you stop to help, trusting in your kindness, or keep driving, listening to that instinct that tells you not to take the risk? This is a choice many people have faced, but not all have had the outcome they expected. Today's story is about one of those decisions, a hitchhike that began as a kind gesture and turned into one of the most terrifying moments in the driver's life. It was a hot summer afternoon, and I was driving back home after spending the day lost on hiking trails. The trek was exhausting, and my muscles still ached as I drove down an isolated road. About 25 kilometers remained before reaching my house, which was in a more remote area surrounded by open fields and few properties. That's when I saw him, an overweight man wearing tattered, dirty clothes, walking along the roadside. He looked tired, his face red from the sun and his steps slow, like someone who had walked farther than they should have. My first instinct was to speed up and keep going. After all, I wasn't obligated to help, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was his exhausted expression or the fact that I had just experienced a long walk myself. The thought of leaving him there under the scorching heat made me feel guilty, so I slowed down and signaled for him to get in. He thanked me with a weak smile and got in, tossing a worn backpack onto the floor of the car. When we exchanged a quick glance, I felt immediate discomfort. His eyes seemed empty, but there was something else, an almost predatory glint that made me swallow hard. Still, I tried to ignore it. He was just a tired man, right? As we continued down the road, he began to talk about his life. He said he was a heavy machinery operator but was unemployed and on the verge of losing his house. I felt bad for him, but something about the way he spoke made me uneasy. It wasn't just the content of his stories, but the tone, as if he were choosing his words too carefully, like someone trying to hide something. While he spoke, I noticed his right arm was prosthetic. It was an old model made of hard plastic with a metal hook in place of a hand. He gestured frequently, and the metallic sound of the hook scraping against the car's console set my nerves on edge. Then he told a story that made my breath catch. According to him, during a snowstorm a few years ago, a wounded woman had appeared at his door begging for help. He said he had put her in the bucket of a front loader and taken her to the nearest hospital. The story sounded heroic, but something about the way he spoke, something was off. As he talked, I began to piece together a different scenario in my mind. What if the woman never made it to the hospital? What if she died before that and he buried her somewhere? It was just a theory, but my intuition told me there was more to the story than he was letting on. As we neared the location where he said he needed to be dropped off, the conversation took a darker turn. He began making strange insinuations, something that left me uncomfortable. I tried to change the subject, but he persisted. More and more, his words made it clear that he had no intention of leaving the car easily. My heart raced. I began planning what I would do if he tried something. My seatbelt was fastened, but his wasn't. If necessary, I would accelerate and brake hard, throwing him out. It was risky, but it seemed like my only way out. When I finally stopped in front of the house he claimed was his, something shifted. He didn't get out of the car. He just stared at me, lifting his prosthetic arm in a threatening way. His eyes seemed to pierce mine, as if he were evaluating how far I was willing to go. Seconds felt like hours. I kept my gaze firm, trying to hide the fear growing inside me. Finally, he opened the door and stepped out, but not before casting one last look that made me question whether I would get out of that situation unscathed. I sped away from that house as fast as I could without looking back. I felt relieved to have escaped, but something kept nagging at me. I decided not to call the police. After all, what would I say? That a stranger made me uncomfortable? That he told a weird story? It didn't seem like enough. It was only years later that I discovered the truth. The property where he lived became the center of a police investigation. A missing woman was found dead in a freezer dumped in a nearby lake. The freezer had come directly from that house. The connection was clear. The man who got into my car was far more dangerous than I could have imagined. To this day, I think about what could have happened if he had decided to act that night. if I had hesitated or shown fear. This story isn't just a tale of terror, but a warning. We live in a world where acts of kindness can be exploited by those with dark intentions. The question I pose to you is, would you have stopped to help that man? Or would you have listened to that small inner voice telling you to keep driving? In the end, perhaps the only thing that protected me that night was my calm and my instincts. And you? Are you prepared to handle the unexpected?